So today we're going to continue to take looks at some of the battles, specifically 1863. There are three major battles in 1863 that really changed the tide of the war that we're going to focus on. The first of which is Chancellorsville. So Chancellorsville is south of Fredericksburg, where we had a defeat by the Confederacy. So after that defeat, General Burnside was removed and General Joseph Hooker was put in place. And so he came up with the idea to stage an attack against Lee's army, which had entrenched itself south of Fredericksburg. And his strategy was that instead of trying to overwhelm him with superior numbers of forces, he was going to outsmart him. And the way that he was going to do this is send the Union Army in a flanking maneuver or movement around the side of the enemy in hope of gaining the advantage. And so they were going to kind of just sneak around him. And this would allow the Union to attack from both the front and the back. However, Lee, again, one of the greatest generals, very intelligent strategist militarily, he knew what was going to happen. And so he sent another amazing general that the Confederacy had, General Stonewall Jackson, to encircle Hooker's troops and attack them. And so essentially outflanking Hooker's flanking maneuver. So on May 2nd, Jackson surprised Hooker's troops and defeated them. And that day, following the celebration of winning this battle and pushing the Union forces back, Jackson is actually out on a surveying mission. And when he rides back into camp, he is accidentally shot by one of his own soldiers and killed. And many historians believe had Jackson not been killed at Chancellorsville in friendly fire and had been at Gettysburg, that there's a possibility that what happened at Gettysburg would have been different. Speaking of Gettysburg, we're going to watch this short video here.
In June of 1863, Confederate General Robert E. Lee took his Army of Northern Virginia into the North for the second time. The Union commander, George Gordon Meade, was in pursuit. They would ultimately bump into each other here at Gettysburg. Behind me is the town of Gettysburg, around which the Battle of Gettysburg will be fought. The Battle of Gettysburg started by accident. Literally, troops bumped into each other. General Lee heard that Meade was pursuing him, and Lee concentrated his army. The Union vanguard is already here as well, and they're going to bang into each other north and west of town on McPherson's Ridge. It's an intense fight. Ultimately, the fight will grow until north of town. You're going to have the Union 11th Corps fighting against a corps under a guy named Richard Ewell. In the end, you're going to have 30,000 Confederates outflank and whip 18,000 Union troops who retreat back through town to Cemetery Hill and to Culp's Hill, where we stand now. And for the next 24 hours, all that happens is that both sides bring the remainder of their troops here until the Yankees have maybe 90,000 troops and the Southerners have maybe 70,000 troops. And the Yankees form in the shape of a fishhook. And we are right here on this fishhook at the end of Culp's Hill here. The Union line will continue along Cemetery Hill behind me, Cemetery Ridge, and eventually end over on Little Round Top. The Southerners line up around that line, basically formed on the most distant tree line you can see way off in the distance, okay? If General Lee needs to go from one side of his army to the other, it's 6 miles. Meade only has to go 2.5. Meade is also on the defensive. Meade has more men on a more compact line, and Lee is more strung out, and Meade finally has the home field advantage. On the second day of the battle, Robert E. Lee decided to take 20,000 troops under James Longstreet and attack the Union left, and take maybe 5,000 to 10,000 and attack Culp's Hill. But the attack on the Union left flank took place first. The Southerners are going to have to get over there without being seen opposite the Union line. Ultimately, the Southern line will attack what's called an echelon, where a couple of brigades moved in, and then a couple more, and a couple more. And ultimately, Longstreet's men will make fierce attacks. First, they'll fight at Devil's Den and Little Round Top, and then onto the wheat field. And then they actually have found a gap in the middle of the Union line, troops that had gone to reinforce some of the fighting in other areas. But the Confederates can't quite push through it, because wherever they show up, Union reinforcements from inside Meade's strong fishhook position arrive and push the Southerners back. Ultimately, the bloodiest fighting at Gettysburg, the second day on the south end, will come to a close without a decisive result. And while Longstreet is attacking the Union left flank, the Confederates are beginning a huge artillery bombardment on the Union right flank, here on Culp's Hill. That bombardment wouldn't do anything. The Confederate attack doesn't come for long, until long after, actually, the fighting on the Union left flank is mostly over. Ultimately, the Southerners will try to attack East Cemetery Hill. They capture part of East Cemetery Hill. They capture 9 cannons. This is the key Union position at East Cemetery Hill, and it's about to fall to the Confederates. But again, Union reinforcements push the Confederates back. The Confederates have a little bit more success here on Culp's Hill. Culp's Hill consists of 2 hills, an upper hill and a lower hill. This is night fighting, very odd in the Civil War. The Confederates easily capture the lower hill, but they're unable to capture the pinnacle of Culp's Hill. The next day, the fighting resumes, where the Confederates try to capture Upper Culp's Hill. The Yankees return with even more reinforcements, not only recapturing their old trenches in Lower Culp's Hill that they had lost, but maintaining their possession of Upper Culp's Hill. On the third day, having already tested the Union left flank and the Union right flank, the Confederates opted to attack the Union center. And this is what we now know as Pickett's Charge. Pickett's Charge is going to take place in the fields behind me, and on the afternoon of July 3rd, you're eventually going to have a great moan go up from the Union line. This is after a huge artillery bombardment, but the moan comes not from that, but rather from the beauty and pageantry of a great Confederate assault. 12,000 troops advancing across that field, you can see over my shoulder. The Yankees decimated with long-range artillery, and as they reached the road, Union reinforcements poured to the area. The Union flank bulged out, so the Confederates are going to get flanked, but nonetheless, they push on impetuously, gain some of the key stone wall in the area. The Yankees are able to, however, push them back. 6,000 of the 12,000 soldiers who made the attack were killed, wounded, or captured. Lee lost 23 battle flags in that attack, more than he'd lost up to that point in the war combined. Robert E. Lee horribly failed in Pickett's Charge, but the next day he still stayed here and through the rain across the fields, faced George Gordon Meade, said, "Come on, Meade, attack me." Meade did not take the bait. That night, Robert E. Lee pulled back through the mountains. 9 days later, escaped back into Virginia, and the Civil War goes on for almost 2 more years.
So, as they said, Gettysburg takes place from July 1st to the 3rd of 1863. And the 2 gentlemen on the right are those who are going to be leading on that day. So the Confederacy wanted to invade the North. Part of it was to kind of dishearten the North and give them a little bit of a blow. Another was to persuade Britain and France to recognize the Confederacy and start helping them in this war. Because again, remember, they don't have the manufacturing, and they're running the Union is running a blockade, so they aren't able to get stuff in. So they're hoping that the British and the French are going to help. They also hope to persuade the Copperheads, which is a name that's given to the Democrats in the North. They call them peace Democrats, the ones who want to stop fighting and sit down at a table and come up with an idea of how we're going to negotiate this peace between these 2 sides. The other side of that also is the South saw heavy fighting, especially in Virginia, and in order to grow crops and harvest, they need to take fighting away from Virginia for a while so they can do that. So in June, Lee moves his troops into southern Pennsylvania. Hooker, who, remember, is in charge at Chancellorsville, Hooker also starts heading north, and he's mostly staying on the defensive of trying to keep Washington, D.C. safe. So he stays between Lee's army and the capital. But as the Confederacy moved throughout Pennsylvania, they're taking food and livestock from citizens throughout the countryside. Also, any African Americans they run into, they are capturing and forcing them down into the South into slavery, even if these are freed African Americans. Well, at this time, since Hooker is not engaging with Lee, Lincoln is getting fed up again. And so this time he is going to replace Hooker with General George Meade. And poor Meade, who's the gentleman in the top right, unfortunately is only in charge for just a couple short weeks before he and Lee's troops are going to meet in this small town of Gettysburg in Pennsylvania. So Lee wasn't really sure where the Union troops were, and mostly that's because Meade was kind of keeping his distance. He wanted Lee to not really know what they were up to or where they were. And on June 30th, a Confederate brigade stumbles upon the Union cavalry resting in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, a small town, 2,400 people, about 35 miles north of the capital of Pennsylvania, Harrisburg. And this is going to be the spark to this 3-day battle that's going to occur. So again, Lee's army is kind of scattered across south central Pennsylvania. Meade's army is spread out over about a 25-mile long line, and they're moving north. But as this skirmish starts to break out, both of these armies start rushing towards Gettysburg. On the morning of July 1st, Union forces are outnumbered in Gettysburg, and they meet on the southeast edge of town, and the first shot is fired. And that morning, the Union is able to hold its own at Seminary Ridge and things like that. And as the day progressed and Lee's army strengthens, you have Union soldiers fleeing to the north edge of town through the streets of Gettysburg. By the way, the citizens of Gettysburg knew that things were probably going to be erupting around them. And so many of them had left the town or had moved to a different part of the town to try and protect themselves. So as the Union forces are drove back, they head for the high ground at Cemetery Ridge. Okay. And so it becomes a battle for this high ground. Usually if you have the high ground, you're going to win the battle. So as they are retreating, more Union forces are coming in, and they are able to consolidate at some of the highest points around Gettysburg. And those places are Cemetery Hill, Cemetery Ridge, Culp's Hill, and Little Round Top and Big Round Top. Okay, so some of the highest elevations within that area. Fierce fighting ensues over the next 3 days, well, really the next 2 days, and about 35,000 are killed or wounded at Gettysburg. As he was talking about, a lot of fierce fighting is happening, and it's in these small little skirmishes throughout kind of the landscape of Gettysburg. You have on people's actual farms, they're fighting. You have out in peach orchards and wheat fields, and they talked about Devil's Den, which is a rock formation, very rugged rock formation where the Union is firing down on the Confederates, and it becomes a bloodbath. On day 3, Lee was, first of all, Lee was incredibly overconfident at the start of this battle, almost to his detriment. And on day 3, he makes this decision that he is going to send General Pickett with a large group of men, about 12,000, to attack directly the center of the Union line. Longstreet, which was mentioned in that video, he really tried to convince Lee not to do it, but Lee was determined. He was, he had been winning these victories. He is intelligent when it comes to military strategy. And so Pickett leads his charge across this open field. And across this open field, there are barbed wire fences and different things because, again, you're in a farming community. And so what would happen is this line of troops is moving across this field and essentially being gunned down as they're moving across this field, and it ends up being a humiliating defeat for the Confederacy. And essentially, they're still going to be fighting, but that's really the last Confederate push. On day 4, so on July 4th of 1863, rain starts to fall, and it's during this time that Meade does not pursue Lee further, and Lee starts to retreat back to the river to cross and go back into Virginia. The Confederates end up heading back to Richmond, and this is declared a Union victory. However, Meade had his opportunity to crush Lee as they were waiting to be transported across the river, and he hesitated. And so Lee was able to escape, and unfortunately that means that there's going to be another almost 2 years of fighting. Now we're going to talk about Vicksburg, okay?
By the spring of 1863, Major General Ulysses S. Grant, in command of the Union Army of the Tennessee, was at a crossroads in his career. There was tremendous clamor in the northern press demanding that President Abraham Lincoln remove Grant as commander of the Western Army. Even members of the cabinet urged the president to replace Grant. But the president responded to those critical of Grant by saying, "I can't spare this man. He fights." Thus, by late spring, Grant, realizing that the only viable option left him was to march his army south through Louisiana from his base camps at Milliken's Bend and Young's Point and hurl his army across the mighty river somewhere below the fortress city of Vicksburg and operate against the Confederate citadel from the south and east, the area in which the Confederates would least expect them. Thus, on March the 29th, the orders were issued to begin this movement south through Louisiana, and as the soldiers slogged their way south, corduroying roads and building bridges each step of the way, the Union fleet, commanded by Rear Admiral David Dixon Porter, successfully passed by the batteries of Vicksburg in a fiery display on the evening of April the 16th, and by the end of the month had rendezvoused with Grant at Hard Times Landing, well south of Vicksburg. From that location, on April 30th and into May 1st, Grant would hurl his army across the mighty river and onto Mississippi soil, and the inland campaign to capture Vicksburg began. Over the next 17 days, in what is often referred to as the Blitzkrieg of the Vicksburg Campaign, Grant's forces would push deep into the interior of the state of Mississippi, meeting and overwhelming Confederate resistance in 5 separate actions. At Port Gibson on May 1st, Raymond on May 12th. 2 days later, they would capture the capital city of Jackson. Not wishing to waste combat troops in occupation of Mississippi's capital city, Grant ordered Jackson neutralized militarily. And by that I mean he freely applied the torch to machine shops and factories, cut up railroad lines and telegraph lines. Anything of military value was destroyed. With Jackson neutralized, Grant turned west toward his objective, the fortress city of Vicksburg, and between Jackson and Vicksburg, he would again encounter Confederate forces, this time at Champion Hill on May the 16th. In the largest, bloodiest, and most decisive action in the Vicksburg campaign, Grant would drive Confederate forces led by Lieutenant General John Pemberton from the field of battle in panic and confusion. The following day, along the line of the Big Black, Grant would once again overwhelm Confederate forces and drive them back into the city's defenses. Having defeated the Confederate forces in 5 separate actions, Grant believed that those men responsible for the defense of Vicksburg were greatly demoralized and thought that a quick show of force early on would result in a speedy capitulation of the fortress city. Thus, on May 19 and again on May the 22nd, Grant would hurl his army against the city's fortifications. Although men in blue succeeded in planting their colors atop the parapets in several different areas, they would finally be checked and hurled back with heavy loss. Grant would then decide, as he put it, to outcamp the enemy and lay siege to the city. Throughout the month of May, Grant would slowly extend his lines to the left and to the right until they completely encircled the Confederate garrison in Vicksburg. Once the line of circumvallation was established, Grant's forces then began sinking approaches toward the Confederate line. 13 separate approaches would be constructed throughout the month of June by Union forces, the largest and most successful of which would be along the Jackson Road and known as Logan's Approach. On June the 25th, Union sappers would detonate a mine at the end of Logan's Approach directly beneath the 3rd Louisiana Redan, one of the powerful bastions guarding the Jackson Road entry point into the city of Vicksburg. Although the battle raged in fury for hours and the crater itself slowly filled with the dead and dying men in blue and gray, the Union forces would be denied entrance into the city that day. But by July 1st, Grant's forces had closed all along the line to within just a few yards of the Confederate fortifications. Confederate General John Pemberton, realizing that there would be no help from outside, knowing that his supplies and munitions and rations would soon be exhausted, and knowing that within just a few more days of digging, Union forces could detonate 13 separate mines underneath his fortifications, opened up negotiations with Grant for the surrender of the city. And on July the 4th, the 47th day of siege, the Union Army would march in and take possession of the fortress city that had eluded them for so long. By gaining Vicksburg in July of 1863, it would give the North undisputed control of the Mississippi River, divide the Southern Confederacy in two, and effectively seal the doom of Richmond.
All right, so the Siege of Vicksburg from May 18th through July 4th of 1863 is the pivotal point in the Western theater. So at the same time this is drawing to a close, we have Gettysburg kind of as the turning point over in the East Theater. So again, after the capture of New Orleans, the Confederates still had control about 200 miles on the Mississippi because the North couldn't get beyond Vicksburg. They couldn't get around that hairpin turn in the river. And really, it didn't matter all that much because the Confederates couldn't really ship anything down the river, but they did have control of railroads that crossed the river at Vicksburg. And the Union, remember, according to that Anaconda Plan, needs to cut that Confederacy in half. And Lincoln considers this a key to a Union victory in the grand scheme of things. So Vicksburg is atop a bluff, which allowed them to have the high ground, and it allowed them to fire on Union boats trying to pass them. Between May and June, Union gunships shelled the city's defenses, trying to kind of weaken them. And the Union also tries to reroute the river by digging this 3-mile long canal across this little peninsula just to the north. And it really is a failure. More soldiers die of disease, heat, and sunstroke. And so eventually Grant just abandons that. And in December of 1862, he tries to send General William Tecumseh Sherman to Vicksburg to attack them. And so Sherman is leading his troops across these bayous that are muddy and boggy, and he encounters Confederate forces that are already well dug in and ends up in retreat. Again, in that wintertime from January to May, they try to build this canal again, hoping to reroute that river. They're pulling in slaves that have been freed at plantations as they move towards Vicksburg. And they're continuously shelled by the Confederate batteries, which are groups of artillery pieces which are set up on these bluffs. And so once again, Grant calls it off and abandons it. So what Grant ends up doing is taking 40,000 troops and heading down the west side of the Mississippi River. And he heads down about 30 miles south. And at the same time that this is happening, Union ships are able to come down the river and successfully get past the Confederate troops at Vicksburg. Once there, once Grant's troops and these boats meet up, they're able to cross the river and go back across to the east side. And they end up taking many towns on their march, and specifically they take Jackson, which is the capital of Mississippi, destroying a lot of its industry while they're there. Once they start heading back towards Vicksburg, it is decided that they'll attack, and there's 2 unsuccessful assaults during this time. And so Grant lays siege. He blocked every road, cutting off supplies, and they began shelling. The citizens of the town and the Confederate troops that are stationed there begin living in caves in the back of the hill to escape the dangers of that shelling. And as supplies ran really low, you heard in the video, Pendleton decides that it's time to surrender. And so on July 4th, 1863, as Lee's troops are escaping in Gettysburg to the river to head back to Richmond, Pendleton meets with Grant, and Vicksburg officially is surrendered to the Union and opens the Mississippi up to Union movements freely.